Welcome to Economic Forum, where we discuss various issues affecting our economy in Zimbabwe. My name is John Masugu. Zimbabwe's informal sector has been growing to levels of over 60% since a study carried out in 2019 by the International Monetary Fund. And today we want to look at what have been the causes and where we are now and where we are going to, and how much the informal sector actually contributes to our economy. And to do that, we've invited into the studio economic analyst Victor Boroma to take us through all that. Welcome, Victor, to Economic Forum.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you so much to all your viewers and listeners.
Now, when we talk about the informal economy, just a very brief definition or description so that we are in the right context.
When you look at the informal economy, it is the sector, it basically identifies the sector in a country or employees that are not covered by the legislation or sufficiently covered by local legislation. So in other words, or in layman terms, this is the sector of the economy which does not contribute to the formal channels of the economy in terms of, it could be social security, in terms of tax payments, in terms of paying local levies or licenses to the city councils. So that's what we describe as the informal economy. So by and large, it means all those who are employed in that particular sector do not have a pension and do not actually have any formal regulations that guide their contracts. That's what the informal economy is.
But Victor, be that as it may, it's important to our economy because we've seen it rescuing those who are retrenched from their companies. We have seen it actually contributing some of the products and even sending them back to the formal economy. Tell us about the importance of the informal economy or the informal sector.
So number one, as you highlighted, is the issue of employment. When you look at the statistics that you get from Zimbabwe National Statistical Agency, which is ZimStat, between 80 to 90% of the labor force in Zimbabwe is employed in the informal sector. So when you look at our total labor force, according to ZimStat as well, it's about 8 million, of which half or more than half of that particular labor force is in the diaspora. So when you look at the local labor force, which is around 3.4 million, it effectively means that close to about 2.8 million are employed in the informal sector. So obviously, in terms of job creation, it actually contributes to the national economy. And it's a key contributor. Why? Because the informal sector can employ the unskilled labor force, which is very key, because what it does is it helps in terms of reducing poverty levels. As people can be able to get employment, lower entry requirements enable every other person to be able to get a job. And when we refer to the local labor force, we are looking at all the people that are above the age of 15 years of age who can be able to produce goods and services in an economy. Then secondly, you look also at the overall contribution to GDP. So according to IMF and World Bank figures, Zimbabwe's informal sector contributes about 40 to 50% of the overall GDP. So if we use the 2020 figure from World Bank, which puts our GDP at around 20 billion, what it effectively means is that about 11 to 12% of that particular GDP, which is 11 to 12 billion, comes from the informal sector. Then number three, we talked about it when we discussed the issue of employment, skills development. Why? Because it's low entry level. So if you look at what's happening in the informal sector, it could be all your artisans, it could be furniture making, it could be welding, it could be steel and foundry. All those players enter into that particular sector without the requisite skills, but they are trained. Then the last point, which is very important, the informal sector serves as the launch pad for small to medium enterprise growth. So once you go into the informal sector and you realize a boom in your business, the next thing is obviously to formalize. You go big. So it's a launch pad. So it's very important. Those are the 3 or 4 key points why the informal sector is very important.
So there is a dual economy from what you are saying. How do the two operate so that we can look at how they can both contribute effectively to the economy of Zimbabwe?
There is a dual economy in Zimbabwe. We have got the formal economy, which contributes probably 30 to 40% depending on the figures that you get. And we have got a very big informal sector. So in the informal sector, you largely see that there is a lot of dollarization. There's a lot of cash transactions that happen. So effectively, that means millions circulate in the informal sector daily. So all these transactions are not going into the formal financial sector. There is no banking of proceeds, there is no filing of tax returns, there's no filing of pay as you earn with NASA. The employees, they are not covered by social security and all other social safety nets that the government does provide. So what does it mean, the existence of a dual economy? It means that by and large, government policy in terms of fiscal policy, which is what the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development does to the economy in terms of taxation and government expenditure and all other pronouncements that have to do with public expenditure. And the monetary policy that looks at money supply, that looks at interest rates, that looks at bank supervision. Those two particular policies do not impact the informal sector. So what it means is the informal sector listens to policy, but it goes on as if there is nothing that is happening. So if you want to take a look, for example, what is happening in Bare, you go to Siaso, you go to Gwanda, any other town that you can pick, you see that there are a lot of people that are selling various fast-moving consumer goods from their back, from their vans, the back of the boot, from their houses. That typically is the informal sector. These sell their goods and various products in foreign currency, and they do not follow the formal policies.
In fact, as we close this segment, what also happens is that if authorities then try to move them to a formal place, by and large, they resist that place.
Definitely,
Why?
yes. Obviously, it means they would see it as if as a plan to try and tap them for revenue purposes, for taxation purposes. So they would want to stay away from taxation as far away as possible from being taxed.
So you see a beautiful market there being built for them, but the people will dare not go to that market because of the reasons that you have spelled out. That's Victor Boroma, who is an economic analyst and is our guest tonight on Economic Forum, a program where we discuss these economic issues. So join us in the second segment. We are now in the second segment of Economic Forum, where today we are discussing with Victor Boroma, who is an economic analyst. We're looking at the informal sector, which is growing, and there are quite a number of reasons for its growth. And Victor, why is the informal economy growing? What's pushing it?
What pushes the growth of the informal sector? Number one is there is a very close relationship between increase in inflation, which is currency instability, with informalization. Then there's also a very close relationship or a core relationship between increase in poverty levels and informalization. So what you realize is businesses or any rational enterprise is formed in order to make a profit. So as long as there is currency instability, business people find ways to reduce costs, and taxation is a cost. So if taxes are a cost, obviously businesses would want to informalize in the best way possible so that they increase their profits. So number one is the issue of inflation and loss of value for the local currency, so that people would want to dollarize and stay away from the formal financial sector. Then number two, we also have got very strict and stringent exchange control regulations. So once you deposit, say for example, you make yourselves, once you deposit whatever you get, 20% is converted using a formal exchange rate. And obviously, business people would not want that, because that will result in losses as well. So that increases the level of informalization. Then there are a number of reasons that would also go to low levels of implementation from the tax agency itself. How does it mobilize resources in order to monitor, tax compliance levels? Then limited incentives for all those who are tax compliant. If you are tax compliant, you'd need obviously to get incentives. You'd need to get your rebates on time. So generally, local business players do not see incentives to be tax compliant. So those are some of the reasons that push to high levels of informalization.
In fact, is it possible for you to confirm to us that when you talk about the informalization, you're not only talking about those who have left their jobs, you're also talking about those who are actually formal, trading with the informal sector, things being delivered at CSO and other places around the country by formal industries?
Definitely, yes. So remember, when you actually refer to informalization, it's actually not an institution, it's a practice. So you actually have a situation where corporates that are listed on the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange, who are registered as formal businesses, but undergo informal business transactions. For example, they will quote prices using free market exchange rates. They do not file their returns on time. The directors do not pay, taxes that are requisite. They smuggle goods in, or they smuggle. They do not file their export returns on time. All those things are actually methods used by various formal businesses that are leading to informal operations.
How prevalent is that?
It's very prevalent, because when you look at the figures that we get from 2019, that Zimbabwe has got the second highest informal sector in the world after Bolivia. Bolivia was about 63.5%, Zimbabwe was 60% in 2019, which means now it's probably over 65%. It's prevalent to a level where every business in Zimbabwe, formal business, in one way or another, per each day does at least one informal transaction. When you say informal transaction, instead of going to the bank to buy foreign currency, you find a trader or a dealer to buy foreign currency from. So all those are things that you realize, where you have got 3,000 employees, your tax or your pay as you earn returns show that you have got half of that number. So that's all informalization.
And when we are talking about this informalization, in most cases we do focus on capital cities or large cities. Is it happening across the board? We are also an agricultural country.
Yes.
Are we also finding it out there in the rural areas, on the farms, on the mines, and everywhere?
What you actually realize is the countries that have got high levels of informalization are agro-dependent. And you will realize that even when you want to go and do your research in the countryside, smallholder farming is largely informal, because there's a lot of barter trading that happens outside the formal economy. Someone is trying to sell maize, a goat, a cow. There's a lot of barter trade and informal transactions that happen, cash transactions that happen in the countryside. So actually the level of informalization increases the more you move away from the capital city.
Why is it difficult to stop through government agencies? I know the Grain Marketing Board has been trying by all means to discourage those who buy from the informal buyers and so forth. But across the board, why can't this be stopped for the good of the economy?
The number one reason, I would highlight that because it has been a key reason in the past 3 years. Remember, we talked about the devaluation of the local currency. So what happens is, when you formalize, you are saying to the farmer, deliver your commodity or deliver your maize and be paid in the local currency. But does the local currency maintain value? Can they be able to serve? Can they be able to look after their family while using formal currency, while using the local currency?
Even buying their implements,
exactly,
which are usually quoted
in US dollars. So what it effectively means, it becomes very difficult for the government to formalize, as long as the currency, the domestic currency in which you want to base commodity prices in, is depreciating at a faster rate.
Maybe to conclude this segment, Victor, just give us examples of countries where the informal economy has been properly regulated and is actually contributing to the economy of those given countries, where we would say it's doing well.
So you've got countries such as Mauritius, you've got Botswana, you've got South Africa, that have got the informal sector that is below 70%. So if you actually look at the percentage of tax revenues to GDP, it's actually the highest in Africa. Then you have got countries such as Zimbabwe, Nigeria, that have got Uganda, that have got high levels of the informal sector. Their tax mobilization levels are also very low. So those are some of the countries that you see. But one example that you see that has done very well in terms of formalizing their economy is Rwanda. Rwanda used to have informal sector levels of around 44% in 1990. If you look at them now, it's around 23%.
That's Victor Boroma, who is our guest on today's Economic Forum. We are talking about the informal economy or the informal sector, its contribution to livelihoods, but also how it can be more useful, especially in contributing to the fiscus, so that government has enough revenue for various things that the country may need. So join us in the last segment, that is the third and final segment. We are now in the third and final segment of Economic Forum, where today we are discussing the informal sector, and our guest is economic analyst Victor Boroma. Victor, what are the dangers of having high levels of the informal economy?
So when you look at the role of the government in any economy, the role of the government is to provide policies that ensure growth, in economic growth. Then secondly, to provide public services. So for the government to be able to provide public services, they need to be able to mobilize enough tax revenues. So if the informal sector continues to grow, that means the capacity of the government to mobilize tax revenues also dwindles. That also affects public service delivery. So when you say public service delivery, we are looking at your basics such as electricity, water, proper and well-serviced roads. We're also looking at public transportation. All those are public services that the government would need to provide. So obviously, once the informal sector starts to grow, it means the capacity also decreases. And by and large, as the population increases, public services also depreciate. That means, the public services won't be as good as they used to be, because population obviously is growing at a rate at which the government cannot replace or obviously maintain public services. Then number two, it also incapacitates the government in terms of repayment of domestic and foreign debt. Remember, debt is paid from tax revenues. So once tax revenues start to dwindle, the government will obviously focus on salaries, public expenditure, and default on its debts, and that's what has been happening. Then number three is, once the informal sector grows beyond 50%, it also means a large chunk of your labor force is not covered under social security. So once you lose your job, you do not have a pension. So imagine you are in your 70s or in your 80s, you are diabetic, you don't have accommodation, or you do not have sufficient savings. How will you survive after that? So it's also important to have manageable informal sector, so that all those who are working the labor force can be able to contribute towards their pensions. Then lastly, high levels of informalization are correlated with weaker institutions and increase in corruption levels. Why? Because we've got a lot of cash transactions that are happening in the economy that are bypassing the formal economy. There is no audit trail in the informal sector. So it becomes very difficult to control corruption. It becomes very difficult to control criminal activity, even informal businesses. So those are some of the dangers.
So are those things recorded, especially when there is an audit taking place? Do the accountants actually record that this is what we found? We couldn't come up with proper figures because most of the corporate's business is done informally.
Yes, they do record. You actually realize that most of these formal businesses also deal on a day-to-day basis with the informal sector. So that's the reason why you find that under NDS1, the government is trying by all means to ensure that they capture that particular segment of the economy. And there are estimates that are done by Zimstat. I'm sure you'll be aware that there was a survey which was being done by Zimstat to ensure that they adequately capture the informal sector. And most of the policies inform, what is happening. For example, the introduction of intermediated money transfer tax. It was really aimed at addressing the informal sector.
Victor, obviously, as an economic analyst, you have your own recommendations that you may have discussed elsewhere where you belong as an economic analyst. What are the major recommendations that you would put forward in today's Economic Forum?
All right. So I will have 3 or 4 recommendations that are quite key. Some of these, initiatives are actually being done or implemented. Number 1 is the issue of fiscalization. So fiscalization basically refers to the capturing of transaction in live or online transactions that you are doing. So as you sell, there's a fiscal gadget that captures the transactions that are happening, and Zimra has got visibility of whatever is happening. That's what is called fiscalization. So for the fiscalization to happen, there's a gadget, that is connected to your broadband that you have to have as a player or as a business or as a trader. But the uptake of fiscalization has been very low. Why? Because obviously players do not want to, pay taxes. So what does the government do to improve, the uptake of fiscal gadgets? Number 1 is that the cost of the fiscal gadget has to be borne half by the government, obviously it's benefiting from tax payments, and half by the player. Then number 2, the government can also be able to partner the financial sector, it could be commercial banks, in order to spread the cost of the gadget. So what do we mean? Remember, you'll be paying taxes, and these are, they will be reflected. You do not necessarily need to pay for the gadget. The amount that goes to repaying the gadget can be deducted every month. Then secondly, Zimra also has to improve levels of automation. You do not need to file any paperwork to be tax compliant. You can actually do it online. Then number 3, there have to be incentives for tax compliance. For example, if any corporate or if any retailer, if any producer is tax compliant, they need to see benefits of actually paying taxes. What does the government do? They have to make sure that they move away the informal sector that are operating close to the vicinity of the formal players. And
so that they don't disrupt the formal
players. Obviously, because you've got a packet of sugar that is selling at $2.50 outside, but selling at $3 inside the shop. Someone will simply buy outside.
From outside.
Then lastly, in terms of transparency as well, whatever the government is collecting in terms of tax revenues has to be seen to be working, so that you improve confidence amongst the taxpayers. So that's one of the key factors. We have to improve roads. Public services also have to be improved by the government, so that there is compliance in terms of tax payments.
And people have to see that.
Yes, they have to see that our taxes are actually effectively working to better and improve our economy and our lives.
And what kind of education is going out there to the people, so that we actually utilize our informal economy more effectively than this play a game of hide and seek that you have been mentioning in the program?
Yeah, the Zimbabwe Revenue Authority, obviously under NDS1, have been trying by all means to educate. There are a lot of workshops that are happening. Even when you go to your informal market in Harare, in Bari, they are there daily, trying by all means to ensure that they educate and show the business community that there are benefits of actually being formal and how to formalize their operations.
Yes. Victor Boroma, an economic analyst who has been with us today on Economic Forum, and he has been talking about the informal economy, how it is benefiting livelihoods in Zimbabwe, as well as how it can also be regulated so that it contributes to the fiscus. And Victor has just mentioned that we cannot do away with it completely, but it can be reduced to manageable levels so that it's impactful. Victor, would like to thank you very much for coming on to Economic Forum.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
You can get in touch with us on the numbers that are showing on your screen, and you can also get in touch with us on the social media platforms that are being displayed. And if you miss some episodes of Economic Forum, you can visit our YouTube channel, which is Economic Forum Zimbabwe, and view some of the past episodes, including this one with Victor Boroma. So from the production crew, this is John Masugu.